Good evening and welcome. Find a comfortable place to rest. Let your shoulders fall, let your breathing slow, and let the world grow quiet around you. There is nowhere you need to be tonight, and nothing you need to do. Tonight, we drift back more than 100 years, across a dark and endless ocean, to the story of a ship, the grandest ship the world had ever known. Imagine for a moment the cold North Atlantic at night. The water is black and still, smooth as polished glass beneath a sky crowded with 1,000 stars. There is no moon. There is no wind. Only the faint hiss of the sea against a moving hull, and far out in that immense darkness, a single ship gliding quietly through the calm, her portholes glittering like a small golden city adrift upon the deep. They called her unsinkable. The largest, safest, most luxurious vessel ever built. They called her the ship of dreams. Her name was Titanic. And this is her story, told slowly and softly, so that you may drift away as it gently unfolds. It began not upon the water, but in the smoke and thunder of a great shipyard in Belfast, in the north of Ireland. Here, at the yards of Harland and Wolff, beneath towering cranes that scratched the low gray sky, thousands of men labored in a world of iron and fire and endless noise. The dream itself belonged to ambitious men in warm, paneled offices far from the cold of the yard, shipping magnates who wished to rule the crossing of the Atlantic. They did not merely want a ship. They wanted a floating palace. A marvel so vast, so luxurious, so magnificent, that the wealthy of the world would cross the ocean upon nothing else. They spread their great blueprints across the tables and dreamed of a giant. And so, out in the yard, the work began. Rivet by rivet, plate by plate, her vast iron hull rose slowly against the Belfast sky, until she loomed over the city itself, dwarfing the men who crawled across her like tiny figures upon the flank of a mountain of steel. For 3 long years they built her. 15,000 men. They worked through the freezing rain of winter and the heavy heat of summer, driving 3 million rivets into her body by hand, each one hammered glowing hot into place by teams of sweating, straining workers. They were riveters and welders, carpenters and painters, ordinary working men with soot on their faces and calloused hands, who went home each night to small brick houses in the narrow streets, and rose again long before dawn. It was dangerous work, high above the ground, among swinging chains and red-hot iron. Some men fell. Some were badly hurt. A few lost their lives before the ship had ever touched the sea. Few of them would ever set foot aboard the palace they were building. Yet every rivet they drove carried a piece of their labor and their lives out onto the ocean. And slowly, magnificently, she took her shape. A hull longer than any structure that had ever moved upon the earth. Decks rising story upon story, until she stood as tall as an 11-story building, black and gleaming and immense, waiting only for the sea. Among the builders was one man who loved her more than any other. His name was Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief designer, a big, kindly, tireless Irishman who seemed to know every rivet and every corridor of her by heart. He walked her decks at all hours, a roll of plans beneath his arm, noting 100 small things. A door that stuck, a light that flickered, a stairway that might be made a little finer. He knew where every pipe ran and where every wall stood. To Thomas Andrews, the Titanic was not steel and rivets. She was almost a living thing, and he tended her as a father might tend a child. He, more than anyone, understood exactly how strong she was, and one day soon exactly how she might die. On a spring morning in 1911, more than 100,000 people gathered along the water to watch her enter the sea for the first time. They crowded the docks and the wharves and the rooftops, their faces upturned, their breath rising in the cold air, a great restless ocean of people come to witness a wonder. There was no bottle of champagne, no grand ceremony. That was not the way of this shipyard. Only a signal, a hush, a rush of workers knocking away the last supports. And then, slowly at first, and then faster, the enormous hull began to move. 26,000 tons of iron slid down the greased slipway and met the water in a vast surge of foam, and the crowd roared as the ship of dreams floated free for the very first time. Yet she was, as yet, only an empty shell, a bare black hull without engines, without funnels, without a single chandelier. The true wonder was still a year away. For another year they fitted her out, and what they made inside her was almost beyond belief. Within that iron hull they built an entire world of splendor, a world made, above all, for the rich. There was the grand staircase, sweeping down through several decks beneath a great dome of wrought iron and glass, its oak panels carved and gilded, its steps wide and shallow, so that elegant ladies in trailing silk gowns might descend them like queens entering a court. There were dining saloons as large as ballrooms, a swimming bath filled with heated seawater, a gymnasium with mechanical horses, Turkish baths tiled in blue and gold, a squash court, and cafes modeled upon the finest in Paris. Stewards in crisp white jackets moved silently along the carpeted corridors. Fresh flowers stood upon every table. Fine china, cut crystal, and polished silver gleamed beneath 1,000 electric lights. To step into first class aboard the Titanic was to step into a floating palace, where wealth bought a comfort the world had never before carried across the open sea. And then came the day. The 10th of April, 1912. In the great English port of Southampton, she lay against the quay, her 4 enormous funnels rising into a pale spring sky, her black hull towering over the sheds and the crowds, her decks already swarming with life. The dockside was a sea of people. Families pressed against the railings. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Porters hurried past beneath mountains of trunks and cases, and the salt air was thick with the sound of farewells, laughter and weeping, promises and last embraces, handkerchiefs waving against the gray. One by one, along the gangways, the passengers climbed aboard. More than 2,000 souls would sail upon her, drawn from every corner of the world and from every rank of human life. Each of them carried a suitcase. Each of them carried a story. And each of them carried, in some quiet chamber of the heart, a hope. In first class traveled some of the richest people alive. Their combined fortune, it was said, was greater than that of many small nations. There was John Jacob Astor, one of the wealthiest men in all America, returning home with his young wife. There was Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a vast mining empire, traveling in the finest of style. And there was Isidor Straus, the elderly owner of a great department store, walking the decks arm in arm with his beloved wife Ida, the two of them inseparable after a lifetime together, unwilling to be parted even for a moment. They dressed for dinner in silk and diamonds. They dined upon oysters and roast duckling and glittering iced desserts. They strolled the promenade decks wrapped in furs and reclined in deck chairs beneath warm woolen blankets, gazing out at an ocean that seemed to belong entirely to them. For these fortunate few, the Titanic was not merely a crossing. It was a celebration of everything money could buy. Among them moved brighter, warmer figures too. There was Margaret Brown, a spirited, big-hearted American woman, born poor and made suddenly rich, who laughed loudly, spoke her mind, and cared little for the stiff manners of the wealthy. History would remember her by another name, the unsinkable Molly Brown. And there were the young lovers, honeymoon couples newly married, crossing to begin their lives together. They danced in the evenings and lingered at the rails beneath the stars, wrapped in coats and in one another, whispering of the home they would build, the children they would raise, all the long and ordinary years they believed lay gently ahead of them. But far below the chandeliers and the champagne, in the plain lower decks of the ship, traveled a very different kind of passenger, and, in truth, the beating heart of her story. They were the emigrants. Hundreds upon hundreds of them. Poor families from the villages of Ireland and the farms of Sweden, from Italy and Syria and Lebanon, leaving behind everything they had ever known and everyone they had ever loved, crossing the cold ocean toward a single shining word, America. When the ship called at Queenstown on the green coast of Ireland, the last of them came aboard in little boats, young men and women with the soil of home still on their boots, looking back one final time at the fading hills they would never see again. One girl, they say, played a lament upon the pipes as Ireland slipped away behind her. They carried their whole lives in battered trunks and cloth bundles. A mother with a sleeping child upon her shoulder. A young man with a few coins sewn carefully into the lining of his coat. Sisters traveling together toward a brother who had gone ahead and written home of streets that shone with promise. They slept in narrow bunks, ate plain and hearty food, and gathered in the evenings in the bare third-class rooms to sing the old songs of the homelands they had left forever. For them, the Titanic was not luxury. It was a doorway, the narrow, shining doorway to a whole new life. High above them all, upon the bridge, stood the master of the ship, Captain Edward John Smith. He was a tall, broad, white-bearded man of 62, calm and courteous and deeply respected, the most senior and most trusted captain of the entire line. The wealthy asked for him by name. The Titanic was to be the crowning voyage of his long life at sea, his very last before a quiet retirement. Beneath him served his officers, dependable men in dark blue uniforms who kept the watches through the day and the night. Among them was the first officer, William Murdoch, a steady and experienced Scotsman, quick of eye and sure of hand. Upon such men rested the safety of 2,000 lives, though few aboard ever gave them a passing thought. And far, far down, in the very belly of the ship, in a red-lit world of heat and coal dust and deafening noise, labored the men who made her move. The firemen and the trimmers. Hundreds of them. Stripped to the waist and slick with sweat, they shoveled coal into the great roaring furnaces, hour upon endless hour, feeding the boilers that drove her mighty engines. It was brutal, exhausting work in a world without daylight. They never once saw the chandeliers or the flowers or the fine china far above their heads. They knew the Titanic only as heat and darkness, and the trembling of the deck beneath their feet, the trembling of the power they themselves fed into her heart. For 4 golden days, life aboard the Titanic was a waking dream. The weather held fair, the sea stayed kind, and the great ship glided steadily westward, so smooth and so vast that a passenger might set a glass of water upon a table and watch it barely tremble. In the first-class lounge, a small band of musicians played gentle, graceful airs while ladies took their afternoon tea from silver pots. Couples danced. Children raced along the promenade and spun their tops upon the polished decks. In the evenings, the dining saloons glowed with candlelight and quiet conversation, and soft laughter drifted out across the darkening water. Everywhere aboard her there was a feeling of ease, of comfort, of complete and perfect safety. Passengers wrote long letters home describing the marvel upon which they sailed. How steady she is, they wrote. How grand, how splendid. One could almost forget that one was at sea at all. The music aboard the Titanic came from a small group of gifted men, led by a gentle young violinist named Wallace Hartley. By day and by evening they played in the lounges and the reception rooms, waltzes and ragtime, soft melodies and lively tunes, filling the ship with warmth and grace. They were, all of them, fine and dedicated musicians, proud of their work, who wished only to bring a little beauty to the voyage. None of them could have known, as they played their cheerful airs beneath the electric lights, how their music and their courage would one day be remembered by the whole of the world. Yet out ahead, in the darkness the passengers could not see and did not think of, the ocean held a danger as old and as patient as the sea itself. That spring, the North Atlantic was strewn with icebergs, great pale mountains of ice, calved from distant frozen shores, drifting silently southward into the shipping lanes. And all through the voyage, other ships sent their warnings crackling through the night by wireless. Field ice. growlers. Great bergs, they said, directly in the Titanic's path. In the little wireless room, two young operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, sat among their instruments and worked without rest. But their desk was buried beneath a mountain of private messages, the cheerful telegrams of wealthy passengers to friends and business partners on shore. The men worked feverishly to send them all. Some of the ice warnings were carried at once to the bridge. Others were set aside, unread, beneath the growing pile. And still the great ship pressed on, swift and certain, into the dark. The evening of the 14th of April was the coldest of the entire voyage. The temperature fell steadily, down and down toward freezing, until the very air seemed to sharpen. And the sea grew strangely, almost unnaturally calm, flat and black and smooth as a sheet of dark glass, without a breath of wind or a single breaking wave. In the warm and glittering dining saloon, the passengers enjoyed a magnificent dinner, wholly unaware. Above them, through the cold, clear air, the sky blazed with more stars than most of them had ever seen in all their lives, and every one of those stars lay mirrored, perfectly, upon the glassy water below, so that the great ship seemed to sail silently through a boundless sea of stars. It was beautiful beyond words. It was serene. And it was deadly. For on so windless a night, there were no waves at all to break white against the base of an iceberg, nothing to betray its presence in the darkness until it should rise up, silent and enormous, almost on top of them. Near the end of the evening, First Officer Murdoch took his place upon the bridge for the cold night watch, peering out into a darkness that seemed to swallow the very light of the stars. And high above him, higher than all the decks, in the crow's nest at the top of the forward mast, two lookouts kept their lonely, freezing vigil. Their names were Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. They had no binoculars. The ship's pair had somehow been mislaid before she sailed, and so they strained their bare eyes into the blackness ahead, hour after hour, with nothing but their own sight to guard 2,000 sleeping souls. It was 11:40 at night. The ship rushed on across the freezing, glassy calm, faster than she had traveled the whole voyage. And then, rising out of the blackness directly ahead, Fleet saw something. A shape darker than the dark. A vast and silent mass, growing larger with terrible speed. He rang the bell above the nest 3 times, the signal for danger dead ahead. He snatched up the telephone to the bridge, his heart hammering, and when at last a voice answered, he spoke the 3 words that would echo down through all the years to come. Iceberg right ahead. On the bridge, Murdoch moved in an instant. Hard a starboard. The engines full astern. The order to close the great watertight doors. Slowly, agonizingly, ponderously, the enormous ship began to answer her helm, her bow swinging, inch by inch, away from the mountain of ice. For a few held breaths, it seemed she might yet clear it. The vast pale berg came sliding down her starboard side, towering high above the boat deck, close enough to touch, and chunks of ice broke away and tumbled down onto the forward well deck, where a handful of startled passengers picked them up and tossed them about, laughing like children in the first snow. But beneath the black water, unseen by any living eye, the ice was doing its silent and terrible work. Along nearly 300 feet of her hull, below the waterline, the berg pressed and buckled her iron plates and sprang the seams between them, not one great gaping wound, but a long line of quiet, fatal ones. And through them, cold and patient and unstoppable, the sea began to enter the ship of dreams. At first, almost no one understood. The great collision had been so strange, so gentle, that many passengers never woke at all. Some felt only a faint shiver, a distant grinding, and turned over and settled back into sleep. In the lounges, the card games went on. The band played still. But far below, in the mail room and the forward holds, water was already rising, cold and black and utterly relentless, climbing the stairways, spreading across the floors. The crew who hurried down into those depths saw it, and their faces turned pale, for they began to grasp what the sleeping passengers above them could not. Captain Smith was summoned to the bridge. And Thomas Andrews, the man who knew every rivet of her, was called to read the wound. Together, by lamplight, they bent over the great plans of the ship and made the terrible, simple calculation. Too many of her forward compartments were open to the sea. One by one they would fill and drag her head down until the water spilled over into the next and the next and the next. The mathematics was merciless. The unsinkable ship was going to sink, in perhaps 2 hours, no more, and there were lifeboats aboard for barely half the souls she carried. Above them, for now, the lights still glowed golden and warm. The band still played its gentle airs. The stars still shone in their countless thousands upon the flat and glassy sea. And the long, unforgettable night of the Titanic had only just begun. So let your eyes close now, and let the story carry you onward, softly, into the quiet and the dark. For a long while after the ice had passed, the Titanic did not feel like a ship in danger. She lay quiet upon the flat black sea, her engines stilled, her lights burning warm and golden along every deck. There was no alarm bell ringing through the corridors, no rush of frightened feet. Only a deep and unusual silence, and beneath it, felt more than heard, the faintest change in the angle of the floor. Passengers stirred slowly from their cabins, wrapped in coats over night clothes, asking one another in low, unhurried voices what had happened. A few had felt the tremble. Most had felt nothing at all. Stewards moved among them, calm and courteous, saying only that there was nothing to fear, that it was a precaution, that they might dress warmly and come up to the boat deck when they were ready. And so, for a time, the great ship remained a place of quiet order, her passengers moving without haste, believing, as they had believed all along, that the systems around them would hold. Here and there, in the warm, bright corridors, small questions began to move from mouth to mouth, gentle as a draft beneath a door. Had the ship stopped? Yes, she seemed to have stopped. Was that not strange, in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of the night? A steward asked, would smile and say it was nothing, a small matter, that they had perhaps slowed for the ice, that all was well, and would the lady like anything brought to her cabin? And the passenger, reassured, would return inside and close the door and think no more of it for a while. For nothing in their experience gave them any reason to be afraid. They were aboard the largest, safest ship in the world, upon a calm and starlit sea, with the lights burning and the heat flowing and the whole vast machine humming quietly around them, exactly as it should. A stopped engine was a small thing, a curiosity. It was not, could not be, the beginning of the end. And so the questions rose, and were gently answered, and settled again, and the ship sailed on toward her fate through an hour of perfect, terrible calm. In the first-class smoking room, warm and paneled in dark wood, a few gentlemen sat on at their cards, as they had every evening of the voyage. Someone had brought word of ice, of a stop, of chunks of it out on the forward deck, and one or two had strolled out to look and come back rubbing their hands against the cold and settled again into their chairs. The game went on. Glasses were refilled. The talk turned, unhurried, from ice back to business, to markets and horses and the affairs of the day. There is something almost tender about it, seen from this distance. These men, in the last hour of their lives, playing out a quiet hand of cards in a warm room, so certain of the floor beneath them that the thought of real danger never truly crossed their minds. It was not foolishness. It was trust. The deep, unexamined trust of people who have never once been failed by the great machine that carries them, and who cannot imagine, until it is upon them, that tonight, for the first time, it will not hold. When at last the stewards came knocking, door after door along the sleeping corridors, and asked the passengers gently to dress warmly and put on their lifebelts and come up to the boat deck, they were met, more often than not, with a mild reluctance. It was cold up there and warm here. It was the middle of the night. The bed was soft, and the cabin snug, and the whole idea seemed a great and unnecessary fuss over nothing at all. Some rose and dressed and went up, more out of good manners than fear. Some argued and had to be gently pressed. Some put on the bulky life belt over their nightclothes, felt faintly ridiculous in it, and sat down again to wait, certain they would soon be told it was all a mistake and sent back to bed. Very few felt the cold hand of real dread. The ship gave them no reason to. She lay so steady, so bright, so enormous and sure beneath them, that to believe she was dying required an act of imagination almost no one aboard could yet perform. Up on the boat deck, in the freezing air, a strange and dreamlike scene took shape. Passengers stood about in little groups, wrapped in furs and overcoats thrown over evening dress or nightgowns, their breath rising white, watching the crew work at the boats with a kind of mild, detached curiosity. Children, half asleep, leaned against their mothers. Somewhere the band was playing. The great funnels loomed overhead against the blaze of stars. It did not feel like a disaster. It felt, if anything, like some odd late entertainment, a novelty of the voyage to be described in letters home. The deck was solid underfoot. The lights were bright and warm-looking. The lifeboats, swinging out over that dreadful drop into the dark, seemed the least appealing place in the world to be. And so people lingered and chatted and watched and were slow to step forward when the call came, because every sense they had told them, wrongly, that they were perfectly safe exactly where they stood. For the crew, moving among them, it was an hour of quiet, gnawing difficulty. Many of them knew or had begun to guess the truth, that the ship was doomed, that there was time for only so many, that every minute of hesitation might cost a life. And yet they had been told, and rightly, that panic would be the deadliest thing of all, that a frightened crowd surging for too few boats would end in horror. And so they carried a terrible knowledge behind calm faces, urging people forward gently, keeping their voices light, never saying the plain and dreadful word. It asked of them a strange kind of courage, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind, to know and not to show it, to feel the seconds running out, and yet to smile and reassure, and coax a frightened woman into a boat as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Some of them would step back at the end and be lost. But through that long hour they held the line between order and terror with their own steadiness. And because they did, the boats went down without the madness that might so easily have come. There is a lesson folded quietly into that hour, though this is no night for hard lessons. It is only this, that the greatest dangers so often do not come roaring. They come softly. They come dressed as an ordinary evening, with the lights on and the music playing and everyone quite sure that all is well. The iceberg had already done its work. The ship was already dying. And still, for a long while, the card games went on, and the warm rooms glowed, and the danger wore so gentle a face that almost no one could see it for what it was. It is not a thing to be afraid of, lying here in the warm dark. It is only a thing to hold gently as the story drifts on, that calm and care and quiet attention matter most precisely when nothing seems wrong, that the world is not always as solid as it looks, and that this, perhaps, is why we tell the old stories at all, not to frighten ourselves, but to remember softly, to be tender with the fragile, ordinary miracle of a night when all is well. And then, so gradually that no one could have named the moment, the mood began to change. It was in the tilt of the floor, grown just perceptible now. It was in the faces of the crew, a shade too set, a shade too careful. It was in the flight of a distress rocket, hissing suddenly up into the night and bursting in a shower of white stars high above the ship, and in the strange, dawning quiet that followed it, as people looked up and looked at one another and began, at last, to understand. The card players laid down their hands. The passengers who had lingered began to move with a new and different purpose. Wives reached for husbands' arms. The gentle unreality of the hour thinned and broke, and beneath it, cold and plain, lay the truth they had all been so slow to see, that the ship was going down, that there were not boats enough, and that the warm, bright world around them, which had seemed so perfectly, eternally secure, had perhaps an hour left, no more, before the sea closed over it forever. High on the boat deck, in the bitter cold, the crew began their work. Canvas covers were stripped from the lifeboats. Ropes were uncoiled. The davits, the great iron arms that would swing the boats out over the side, were made ready. The men worked steadily, their breath rising in white clouds, their hands stiffening in the freezing air. There were 20 boats in all. 20 small wooden shells for more than 2,000 souls. It was more than the law of the time required, and yet it was not nearly enough. But in those first quiet minutes, few paused to count. The boats were readied not in panic but in procedure, the way a drill is carried out, and the passengers who gathered to watch felt more curiosity than fear. The ship beneath them was vast and steady and brilliantly lit. The lifeboats, by comparison, looked small and frail and unnecessary, swinging out into the dark above a drop that made the stomach turn. And so, when the order came at last to load the boats, the passengers hesitated. Who would trade the warm, bright, unmoving decks of the greatest ship in the world for a tiny open boat, lowered by rope 70 feet down into a black and freezing sea? It seemed, in that moment, the more dangerous choice by far. Women drew back from the rail. Husbands and wives, unwilling to be parted, stepped away together to wait. Some passengers returned below to their cabins, to sleep, or to fetch some small treasured thing. The crew urged them gently, then less gently, but without visible danger the words carried little weight. And so the first boats were lowered only half filled, swinging down past the rows of glowing portholes, carrying a fraction of the lives they might have saved. No one yet truly believed that the Titanic could die. The officers did their best in a situation for which no one had ever truly prepared them. The order was simple to speak and hard to carry out: women and children first. But what did it mean exactly? On one side of the ship, First Officer Murdoch read it gently: women and children first, and then, if seats remained and no others waited, a man might climb aboard. On the other side, Second Officer Lightoller read it as an iron law: women and children only, and boats were lowered with empty places rather than let a single man take a seat. Neither man was cruel. Both were doing their duty as they understood it, in the cold and the dark, with the lives of strangers in their hands. But the small difference between them, a difference of a single word, would decide who lived and who did not. Mothers were lifted into the boats with their children. Wives were parted from husbands with a kiss and a promise that they would meet again soon, aboard some rescuing ship by morning. Many of those promises would never be kept. And through it all, upon the deck, the band went on playing. Wallace Hartley and his musicians had gathered near the entrance to the grand staircase, and there, in their evening dress, in the freezing air, they played. Waltzes at first. Cheerful, familiar tunes, meant to calm the crowd, to hold back panic, to lend a little grace to a night that was slipping out of everyone's control. They did not have to stay. No order compelled them. They stayed because they chose to, because they understood, perhaps better than the passengers hurrying past, what was coming, and decided that if it must come, it would come to the sound of music rather than to the sound of screaming. They played on as the deck grew colder, as the boats pulled away, as the angle of the floor grew slowly steeper beneath their feet. It is one of the most enduring images of that night. A small group of men playing beautifully into the dark for people who could no longer be saved. Among the wealthiest men aboard was Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a great fortune, who had come up onto the deck at first in the lifebelt and the rough sweater the crew had pressed upon him. But a little while later he went back down to his cabin, and his valet with him, and there the two of them dressed, slowly and carefully, in their finest evening clothes, white tie, black coat, every detail correct, and came up again to face the end as if they were going in to dinner. "We have dressed in our best," he is remembered to have said, "and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He asked that a message be carried to his wife, far away, if any man aboard should live to carry it. "Tell her," he said, "that I played the game out straight and fair, that no woman was left aboard this ship because Ben Guggenheim was a coward." And then he settled into a deck chair with a cigar, calm and courteous to the last, and waited in his fine black coat for the cold sea to climb the deck. There was an old man and an old woman aboard, Isidore and Ida Strauss, who had been married for more than 40 years and had scarcely spent a night apart in all that time. When the boats were loading, the officers, out of respect for their years, urged Ida into a place and urged her husband, an old man, to go with her. But Isidore would not take a seat while younger men still stood upon the deck. He would not go, he said, before the other men. And so they turned to Ida and begged her at least to save herself. But she stepped back out of the boat and came to her husband's side and took his arm. "We have lived together for many years," she said. "Where you go, I go." And she gave her warm fur coat to her maid, who was weeping, and told her to take it, for she would not be needing it now. And the two old people sat down together upon the deck, arm in arm, as they had sat through 40 years of evenings, and there they stayed side by side, and were not parted even by the sea. All across the tilting deck, that same quiet parting was happening, over and over, in the cold and the dark. Young wives, newly married, were lifted into the boats while their husbands stepped back and let go of their hands. There was little weeping and little noise. Mostly there were only low voices and last kisses and gentle, impossible promises. "I will follow in the next boat. I will see you in the morning. It is only for a little while." Some women refused to go and clung to the men they loved and had to be gently unwound and handed down into the boats against their will. Some hid and slipped back to their husbands after the boat had gone. And some men, in the confusion and the dark, did find their way into the boats and lived and carried the memory of that night for all their remaining years. But for the most part, upon that deck, the ones who went were the women and the little children, and the ones who stayed behind and watched the boats grow small upon the black water were the men. Somewhere in those last hours, Thomas Andrews, the man who had built her and who loved her more than anyone, was seen alone in the first-class smoking room. His lifebelt lay cast aside upon a table. He stood before the great painting on the wall, quite still, staring at nothing, a man watching the thing he had made and understood and could not save slipping quietly away beneath him. He had spent the night helping others into the boats, urging strangers to save themselves. Now, at the end, he simply stood and waited with his ship. And Captain Smith, the old master on his last voyage, moved through the chaos with a strange and gentle calm, giving what orders he still could, and then, when there were no more orders left to give, releasing his men at the last from their duty. "Well, boys," he is remembered to have said, "you've done your duty. Now it's every man for himself." And then he too passed into the dark and the confusion of those final minutes, and was not seen again, and went down as a captain of the old tradition might have wished, with the ship that had been placed in his care. And far below the millionaires and the gentlemen, in the plain and crowded decks of third class, there were quiet acts of love that no one recorded and no inquiry ever heard. A mother, unable to reach the boats, or unwilling to be parted from a husband who could not come, gathering her children close upon a bunk, speaking softly to them, smoothing their hair, telling them, perhaps, an old story from the country they had left, or singing them the song she had always sung, so that the last thing they should know would not be the cold, or the rising water, or the fear upon the faces around them, but only her voice, and the warmth of her arms, and the ordinary comfort of a night like any other. We do not know their names, most of them. They left no last words that history could keep. They were the hopeful ones, the ones who had crossed an ocean toward a better life, and they met the same dark sea as the richest names aboard, and were gathered into the same silence. But somewhere in that dying ship, a mother held her children and was not afraid, so that they need not be afraid either, and that, too, is part of the story of the Titanic and deserves to be remembered gently in the quiet of the night. Deep within the ship, in the small crowded wireless room, the two young operators bent over their instruments and cried out into the night in the only voice the Titanic had left. Jack Phillips tapped the distress call again and again. First the old signal, CQD, and then the newer one, still strange to many ears, SOS, while Harold Bride ran messages to the bridge and back. Far off across the black water, other ships heard them. The Carpathia, some 58 miles to the southeast, turned at once and drove north through the ice at the greatest speed she had ever made, her captain pushing her engines past every safe limit, racing toward a position she could not possibly reach in time. And nearer still, perhaps only 10 or 20 miles away, lay another ship, the Californian, stopped for the night amid the very same ice. But her single wireless operator had switched off his set and gone to his bunk. Her crew saw rockets rising in the distance and did not understand them. And so the closest help of all slept on, while the Titanic called and called into a silence that, from that direction, never answered. Far below the boat deck, in the plain corridors of third class, the emigrants waited. Many had felt the collision more sharply than the passengers above, for they were closer to the ship's wounded side, and some had already seen the cold water creeping across the floors of the forward holds. They gathered their families, dressed their children, gripped their small bundles of belongings, and tried to make their way up toward the boats. But the way up was long, and confusing and unfamiliar, through a maze of narrow passages and steep stairways they had never been meant to learn. Some found their path barred. Some waited a long time for a guide who was slow to come, or who never came at all. Others knelt together and prayed in the languages of the homes they had left behind. They had crossed an ocean toward a new life, these hopeful ones, and now they waited, patient and frightened, in the depths of the dying ship, while far above them the last of the boats were being lowered into the sea. Slowly, so slowly that at first it could be doubted, the great ship began to lean her head down toward the water. It showed itself in small things. A glass sliding an inch across a table. A door drifting quietly open. The strange new effort it took to walk toward the bow, and the strange new ease of walking toward the stern. The lights still burned. The band still played. But now the passengers who remained could feel it in their own bodies, in the tilt of the floor beneath their feet, and at last the disbelief began to break. Down in the forward well deck, the Black Sea had already risen to swallow the place where, an hour before, laughing passengers had tossed chips of ice about like snow. The water climbed, patient and unhurried, up the great ship, deck by deck, light by light, toward the crowds still gathered in the cold. The final boats went down in a very different spirit from the first. Now there was no reluctance, no comfortable disbelief. Now everyone understood. Passengers pressed toward the few remaining places. The officers held the line as best they could, lifting children over the rail, handing women down into the boats, working with numb hands against the steepening slope of the deck. The last of the standard boats pulled away, and the crew turned to the collapsibles, the flat, awkward, canvas-sided craft lashed near the funnels, difficult to launch even in calm daylight, all but impossible now. Two of them would float away only half ready as the sea came up to meet them. And still, upon the deck, there remained more than 1,000 people for whom there was no longer any boat at all. They stood together in the brilliant light, in the freezing dark, and watched the last small hope row slowly away across the glassy water. By now the bow was deep beneath the sea, and the stern was rising, slowly and terribly, into the star-filled sky. The crowd still aboard climbed toward the high end of the ship, clinging to railings and benches and to one another, as the deck steepened beneath them from a slope into a hill, and from a hill toward a wall. Deep inside her, there came at last a great and mournful sound, the groan and crash of a mighty ship giving way, as everything not fixed in place tore loose and tumbled down through her length toward the drowned bow. And then, for one moment, the 1,000 electric lights that had made her a floating city flickered once, and blazed, and went out, all at once, and the great ship fell into darkness. Under the strain, she broke. Her stern settled back for a heartbeat, almost level, as if she might yet float. And then it, too, tilted up, higher and higher, until it stood black and enormous against the stars, and slid, quietly at the last, down into the sea and was gone. Where the greatest ship in the world had been, there was now only the flat black water and the stars and hundreds of voices crying out in the dark. Those who had gone into that freezing sea felt the cold seize them like a great hand, stealing their breath, their strength, their very thoughts within minutes. And the lifeboats, scattered across the still water, lay only a little way off, close enough to hear every cry, and, for the most part, too frightened of being swamped to row back into the dark and pull the drowning from the sea. Slowly, over long minutes, the voices thinned. The cold did its patient work, and one by one the cries fell silent, until at last there was nothing left but the lap of water against the sides of the boats, and the enormous, indifferent quiet of the North Atlantic under the stars. The Titanic was gone. And her people, those who remained, were scattered now in little boats upon a vast dark sea, waiting for a dawn that seemed as if it might never come. So rest now. The worst of the night has passed. Let the gentle dark hold you, and let the story drift onward, quietly, toward the coming of the light. The lifeboats lay scattered now across a great dark stillness, small and few and far apart. In each of them huddled a handful of survivors, most of them women, many in nightclothes and thin shoes, wrapped in whatever coats and blankets they had thought to bring, pressed close together against a cold that reached into the very bone. Around them the sea was flat and black and utterly calm, and above them the sky blazed with more stars than any of them had ever seen. It was, in its terrible way, beautiful. There was no wind. There were no waves. There was only the soft dip of oars, the low murmur of frightened voices, and the vast, patient silence of the ocean, which had swallowed the greatest ship in the world and now lay smooth again, as though nothing at all had happened upon its surface. The night stretched on, and the cold deepened. Hands grew numb upon the oars. Feet lost all feeling in the icy water that pooled in the bottoms of the boats. The survivors drew closer to one another, sharing warmth where they could, covering the children, murmuring quiet words of comfort into the dark. In some boats, a steady hand took charge, a crewman or a determined passenger who set the others to rowing, both to keep them warm and to keep despair at bay. In a few of the boats, at last, a decision was made to turn back toward the place where the ship had gone down, to search the freezing water for any who still lived. They pulled a small number of souls from the sea, half frozen and barely conscious. But they had waited long, out of fear of being swamped, and for most who had gone into that water, the help came far too late. And so the boats drifted on through the endless hours, their occupants staring out into the darkness, listening, waiting, hoping for a light. It was, they would all remember afterward, an extraordinarily beautiful night. With no moon and no cloud and no wind at all, the stars came down almost to the water, thick and bright and endless, and they lay mirrored in the black glass of the sea, so that the little boats seemed to hang, suspended between two skies. Some who survived said they had never, before or since, seen so many stars, nor seen them shine so clear and so cold. Now and then a great star would fall, drawing its slow line of silver across the dark. The survivors watched them come and go in silence. There was a strange peace in it, a peace that lay very close to sorrow. This vast and shining calm, indifferent and serene, spread out above a sea that had just taken so many. The universe went on turning overhead, unhurried and immense, as though nothing had happened at all. And beneath it the small boats drifted, full of the living and their grief, waiting for the light to change. In the long cold hours, there was little to do but wait and think and hold on to one another. Some of the survivors talked in low voices, saying the small ordinary things that people say to keep the dark at bay. Some prayed. Some were silent, wrapped in their own thoughts, going over and over the last moments, the last words, the last glimpse of a face upon the deck that they now understood they would not see again. The children, mercifully, mostly slept, tucked down beneath the coats and the blankets, warmed by the bodies of strangers. A mother held a child that was not hers, because its own mother was somewhere out on that black water. A young woman gripped the hand of an old one she had never met before that night, and did not let go until the dawn. Whatever divisions had ruled upon the great ship, the rich and the poor, the first class and the third, were gone now, dissolved in the common cold, in the shared dark, in the simple animal need for warmth and nearness. They were only people now in small boats under the stars, keeping one another alive by being close. Time lost its ordinary shape out there upon the water. Without clocks, without landmarks, without the round of meals and bells that had ruled their days aboard the ship, the hours stretched and blurred into one another. Minutes felt like hours. The night felt as though it might have no end at all. The cold pressed in, patient and absolute. Hands stopped hurting and simply went numb. The oars grew heavy. And still, along the eastern rim of the world, no light appeared. Yet the night was turning all the while as nights always turn. The great wheel of the stars swung slowly overhead, marking the passage of the dark for anyone who knew how to read it. Somewhere far to the south, a little ship was driving north through the ice with all her heart. And somewhere far to the east, below the edge of the sea, the sun was already climbing toward them, unseen, unstoppable, bringing the dawn. They did not know it yet, the ones in the boats. They knew only the cold and the stars and the waiting. But the longest part of the night was behind them now, and the light, though they could not see it, was already on its way. Not all of the boats stayed away. In one of them, a young officer named Harold Lowe had gathered several boats together in the dark and tied them side by side, so that they should not drift apart, and then he did a thing that took great courage. He moved the passengers from his own boat into the others, emptying it as much as he could, and then, with a small crew of volunteers, he turned that empty boat around and rowed it back toward the place where the ship had gone down, back toward the cold and the silence where the voices had been. He waited, he said afterward, until the worst of the cries had died away, for to have gone in among them sooner would have been to be swamped and dragged under by the sheer desperate press of the drowning. It was a terrible thing to have to judge, there in the dark, when to go and how long to wait, and he carried it with him ever after. But go he did, and out of that black and freezing water he and his men pulled a few living souls, half frozen, barely breathing, who without him would surely have been lost. A single boat going back against all fear into the dark, and a handful of lives because of it that saw the morning. In the boats, too, it was often the women who found the strength to hold the others together. In one boat there was an American woman named Margaret Brown, the same warm, loud, big-hearted woman who had laughed her way through first class, the one the world would later call the unsinkable Molly. Through the long cold night she took up Anne or herself and rowed, and she set the other women rowing beside her, to keep the blood moving and the fear at bay, and when the frightened man in charge of the boat wished only to drift and wait, she stood up to him without a moment's hesitation, and kept her people pulling toward the hope of rescue. In another boat, a young countess, the Countess of Rothes, took the tiller in her own hands and steered through the whole of that dark night, calm and steady, a lady raised to ballrooms and drawing rooms, guiding a boat full of strangers across a freezing sea. All through the scattered boats it was the same, someone finding, in the cold and the terror, a quiet courage they had never been asked for before, rowing, steering, singing softly to the children, giving up a coat, holding a stranger's hand. Ordinary people, in the worst of nights, being quietly, stubbornly brave. It is worth remembering, as you rest, that even in so dark a story, there was so much gentleness and so much courage moving upon that black water beneath the stars. And then, at last, someone saw it. Far off across the Black Sea, low upon the horizon, a single faint light, and then another. A ship. Coming toward them. Word passed from boat to boat in trembling voices, half hope and half disbelief. Some lit what they had, a scrap of paper, a handkerchief soaked in oil, a last green flare. Anything to be seen, anything to say we are here, we are still here, do not pass us by. The light grew slowly larger. It was the Carpathia, the little liner that had turned in the night and driven north through the ice at a speed she was never built for, her captain risking his own ship among the very bergs that had killed the Titanic, all to reach a position from which no help could have come in time, and yet toward which he had raced with all his heart. She had not been able to save the ship, but she had come, through the dark and the danger, to save whoever was left. As the Carpathia drew near, the black sky began very slowly to soften. Along the eastern edge of the world, a pale gray light crept upward, thinning the darkness, and one by one the great stars went out. And as the light spread across the water, it revealed at last the thing the darkness had hidden all night long. Everywhere. Great pale mountains of it, standing silent upon a flat and glassy sea, the field of bergs through which the Titanic had rushed, and through which the little Carpathia had somehow threaded her way in the dark. and scattered among that ice lay the lifeboats, tiny and frail, and around them, upon the calm and shining surface, floated the quiet wreckage of the night, deck chairs and fragments of wood, and other things at which the survivors did not look for long. The dawn was clear and cold and very beautiful, and it showed them exactly how alone they had been and how narrow the margin by which they had lived. One by one, the boats came in beneath the towering side of the Carpathia, and one by one the survivors were lifted up out of them, and out of that long and terrible night into warmth and safety at last. Those who could climb were helped up rope ladders. Those who could not, the injured, the frozen, the very young, were hoisted up in slings and in canvas cradles and carried gently over the rail. And there, upon the decks of the little rescue ship, they were met with every kindness her people could give. Blankets were wrapped about their shoulders. Hot drinks were pressed into their shaking hands. The passengers of the Carpathia gave up their own cabins, their own clothes, their own beds, to strangers who had lost everything. Slowly, over the long hours of that morning, boat after boat gave up its handful of the living, until the last of them had been brought aboard, and the empty lifeboats swung up after them, and the sea was left quiet and bare. And then came the counting, and with it the full and dreadful weight of what had happened in the night. For as the survivors gathered upon the decks of the Carpathia, wrapped in borrowed blankets, they searched the faces around them for the ones they loved, and again they did not find them. Wives learned that their husbands had not come. Children looked for fathers who were not there. Whole families had gone down with the ship, and whole families waited, in vain, for faces that would never appear. Of the more than 2,200 souls who had sailed upon the Titanic, only some 700 had lived. More than 1,500 were gone. Passengers and crew, the rich and the poor, the famous and the forgotten, the builders and the dreamers, the band that had played to the very end. The sea had taken them all quietly beneath its flat and shining surface, and had closed over them without a trace. There was nothing more that could be done. Captain Rostron of the Carpathia moved his ship slowly across the field of wreckage one last time, searching for any soul that might still, against all hope, be living. There were none. And so, at last, he turned his little ship away from that terrible place and set his course, through the ice and out into the open sea, toward New York, and toward the world that did not yet know what had happened in the dark hours before the dawn. Aboard, the survivors rested as best they could. Some slept the deep, sudden sleep of the utterly exhausted. Others sat awake, wrapped in blankets, staring at nothing, unable yet to understand the size of what they had lost. There was no celebration in their survival. There was only a great and heavy quiet, and the gentle throb of the engines carrying them westward, and, beyond the rail, the wide gray Atlantic, calm again and rolling on, as though the ship of dreams had never sailed upon it at all. So let that gentle motion carry you too, now toward sleep. The night is over. The lost are at rest. And the story has only a little further softly to go. For 3 days, the Carpathia moved westward across a gray and rolling ocean, carrying her 700 survivors and the terrible news they held. And far ahead of her, in the great city of New York, that news arrived first in fragments over the crackling wireless, confused and contradictory and slowly, dreadfully clear. At first the papers said that all were saved, that the mighty Titanic had been damaged but was being towed gently to port. It was what everyone wished to believe. But as the hours passed, the truth broke through, piece by piece, until it could no longer be denied. And so the people came, thousands of them, down to the water's edge, to the White Star offices, to the piers, and there they waited, in the cold and the rain, clutching newspapers and telegrams, searching the lists of names, hoping against hope to find the one that mattered most to them, and dreading with every hour that they would not. It was night and raining when the Carpathia at last came slowly up the harbor, past the crowds that lined the shore in their thousands, silent and straining in the dark. She did not come in like a ship in triumph. She came in quietly, heavily, her decks lined with the survivors of the greatest wreck the world had known. And when at last the gangway was lowered, they came down into the glare of the lights and the hush of the waiting crowd, pale and exhausted, wrapped in borrowed coats. Many of them alone now were days before they had been part of a family. Some were met with cries of joy, with arms flung wide, with weeping. Others walked down into a crowd that held no one for them, and were gently led away. There were no speeches. There was no ceremony. There was only the rain, and the low sound of grief, and the slow procession of the living, coming home from the sea. In the days that followed, the whole world learned the story, and the whole world stopped to grieve. It seemed impossible, and yet it had happened. The unsinkable ship had sunk. The safest vessel ever built had gone to the bottom on her very first voyage, on a calm and starlit night, with more than 1,500 souls aboard. The shock of it ran deep, deeper than the loss of any single ship could explain. For the Titanic had been more than a ship. She had been a symbol of an age that believed in its own certainty, in the endless upward march of progress, in the mastery of man over nature. And in a single quiet night, that certainty had been broken. If the Titanic could sink, then anything could fail. The world that had built her would, within a few short years, stumble into a great and terrible war, and the confident age that she had crowned would pass away forever. She was, in a sense, its last and grandest monument and its first great warning. And so the world asked how. In the weeks that followed, in Washington and in London, the great inquiries were held, and the survivors and the officers and the experts were called to tell, as best they could remember, the story of that night. Slowly, painfully, the picture came together. There had been ice warnings, many of them, and not all had reached the bridge. There had been great speed held through waters known to be dangerous because that was the custom of the time. There had been no binoculars in the crow's nest. There had been a ship, the Californian, stopped for the night only a little way off, whose wireless lay silent and whose crew had watched the rockets rise and had not understood. And there had been the boats, too few by far, and many lowered half empty into the sea. No single hand had caused the disaster. It had come, as such disasters so often do, from many small assumptions, each reasonable on its own, which had quietly aligned on one cold night into catastrophe. Two great inquiries were held, one on each side of the ocean. In America, senators questioned the survivors within days of their landing. In a crowded hotel room thick with reporters, urgent and pointed and sometimes angry, determined to understand how such a thing could be. In Britain, a little later, the questioning was slower and more formal, conducted by learned men in a quiet hall, patient and precise, sifting the evidence of the sea. Day after day the witnesses came, officers and lookouts and passengers, the men who had built her and the men who had sailed her, and told, as best their shaken memories could, the story of that night. The accounts did not always agree. Memory, under such a weight, plays gently false. Two honest people, standing side by side, will remember the same moment differently. Slowly, out of all those halting voices, a picture was drawn, imperfect but clear enough, of warnings received and set aside, of great speed held in dangerous waters, of too few boats, and of a long chain of small and ordinary decisions that no one had meant as harm. The world, in its grief, wanted someone to blame, for it is easier to bear a sorrow if a single hand can be found to have caused it. And so the newspapers looked for villains, and thought they had found one in Bruce Ismay, the head of the line, who had sailed aboard his great new ship and who had, in the end, stepped into a lifeboat and lived. For the rest of his life he would carry that, the whispered question of why he had lived when so many better remembered men had died, though what any of us would truly do, in the cold and the dark of such a night, with an empty seat before us, none can honestly say. Others were praised as heroes, and some of the praise was just and some was shaped more by the need for a good story than by the plain truth. But the deeper answer, when it came, was harder to hold and harder to hate. No single wicked choice had sunk the Titanic. She had been lost by a whole way of thinking, by an age so sure of its own mastery that it had never truly imagined its own failure. The fault, if fault it was, lay not in one man, but in a confidence that nearly everyone had shared. And there were things the inquiries could never fully settle, questions that sank with the ship and were not raised again. How near, exactly, had the Californian lain, and how many might have lived had she come? Why had the boats been lowered so empty in those first quiet hours? Which orders had been given upon the deck in the last confusion, and by whom, and were they obeyed? The sea keeps its own counsel. It gave back the 700, and a scattering of wreckage, and a great silence, and it kept the rest. And so the story has, at its heart, a few things that will never be known, small unlit rooms in a house otherwise well mapped. Perhaps that, too, is part of why it holds us still, for a mystery that can never be closed is one the mind returns to, turning it gently over on quiet nights in the dark. In the months and years that followed, across many lands, the memorials rose. In stone and in bronze, in the great cities and the small hometowns from which the lost had come, the names were carved and the monuments raised. There were memorials to the brave engineers who had stayed below at their posts, keeping the lights burning so that others might see to launch the boats, and who to a man went down with the ship. There was a memorial to the musicians, to Wallace Hartley and his little band, who had played on into the dark, and it is said that when Hartley's body was brought home, thousands lined the streets to see him pass. People who had never known a single soul aboard came to these places to stand a while in silence, for the Titanic had become, somehow, everyone's grief. She belonged now not only to the families of the lost, but to the whole of the world, which had watched its own bright confidence go down with her into the cold, and which came in its thousands simply to remember. It is worth pausing here in the stillness to hold a gentle thought for all of them, not only the famous names, but the forgotten ones. The stokers, black with coal dust, who never saw the stars that night. The stewardesses who went from door to door, waking strangers, and then stood aside from the boats. The postal clerks who died trying to drag the mail sacks up out of the flooding hold, faithful to their small duty to the very last. The hundreds in the crowded lower decks whose names appear on no memorial, and whose stories no one ever gathered. They were not heroes of the kind the newspapers love, most of them. They were ordinary people doing ordinary work or chasing ordinary hopes, on a night that asked of them something no ordinary life prepares. And they met it, most of them, with a quiet dignity that still, across all these years, has the power to move us. So let us keep them, too, for a moment, in the warm dark. The unfamous, the unremembered, the greater part of all who sailed. They were here. They mattered. And they are not forgotten while their story is still told. Yet out of that great loss came change, and it is perhaps the one gentle thing in all this story. For the world looked hard at what had happened, and it resolved that it should never happen so again. From that night onward, it was decreed that every ship should carry lifeboats enough for every soul aboard. No more counting by tonnage, no more assumptions of rescue, a place in a boat for every living person. It was decreed that the wireless should never again fall silent, that ships must keep watch by their sets both day and night, so that no call for help would ever again go unheard in the dark. And out upon the North Atlantic, an international patrol was set to watch the ice, to track the great bergs as they drifted south, and to warn the ships that passed among them. The 1500 did not die for nothing. Every soul who has crossed that ocean safely since has crossed it a little safer for the lessons written, that night, in ice and cold and sorrow. Of all the sorrows of that night, there is one that lingers most, and it is a quiet one. For while the Titanic called and called into the dark, there lay another ship, the Californian, stopped for the night among the very same ice, perhaps only 10 or 20 miles away. Near enough, some believe, that had she come, she might have reached the boats before the worst of the cold, and taken many more of the living from the sea. But her wireless set was dark, her single operator asleep in his bunk after a long day, and so she never heard the frantic calls that filled the air around her. Her watch on deck saw the white rockets rising, far off across the water, and did not know them for what they were, and roused no great alarm. And so, through all those hours, the Californian lay quiet upon the sea, so near and yet so far, while a little way off the greatest ship in the world went down with all her lights, and her people cried out in the dark unheard. It was no act of malice, only a set switched off, a signal misread, a chain of small and ordinary human things. But it is why, from that night on, the world resolved that no ship's ears should ever again be closed while the sea kept its long night watch. As for the 700 who lived, they carried that night with them for all the rest of their days. Some of them almost never spoke of it, folding the memory away in silence, turning back to the ordinary business of living, marrying, raising children, growing old, as though to keep the dark at bay by simply refusing it a voice. Others found that the Titanic had, in a single night, become the thing by which the whole of their long lives would be measured and remembered. There were young wives who had come aboard as brides and gone home as widows, who never married again, keeping faith across all their years with a man last seen stepping back from the rail into the dark. There were small children, lifted half asleep into the boats, who would live on into a distant age their parents could never have imagined, into a century of aeroplanes and space flight and machines that could speak across the world in an instant, carrying, to the very end, the dim and precious memory of a great ship, and a cold, and a sky full of stars. One by one, across the long years, they slipped away, until at last the final living soul who had sailed upon her was gone, and the Titanic passed altogether out of memory and into history. For more than 70 years, no human eye looked upon her. She lay somewhere in the vast and lightless deep, her exact resting place unknown, a legend without a grave, more story now than steel. Ships passed far above her, year after year, never guessing how far beneath their keels she lay. And then, one autumn night many decades later, a small light moved at last through that eternal dark, 2.5 miles down. The eye of a tiny robot craft, lowered on a slender cable from the world of the living. And out of the blackness there rose, slowly, a great wall of rusted iron. A railing. Porthole. An anchor chain. She had been found. She lay broken upon the ocean floor, her bow and her stern torn apart and settled a little distance from each other, gentle now with rust, draped in long curtains of it that hung like ghostly veils. The grand staircase was gone. The wood had long since vanished into the sea. But she was, unmistakably, herself, quiet and vast, and strangely at peace, in a cold dark stillness where no storm would ever trouble her again. It is a strange thing, when you consider it, that of all the ships that have ever crossed the sea, and all the wrecks that have ever come to grief upon it, this one should be remembered so, and loved so, and mourned so 100 years and more after she went down. Greater disasters have come and gone. Larger numbers have been lost. And yet it is the Titanic that the world keeps and returns to again and again in the quiet of its heart. Perhaps it is because she holds in a single night so much of what it is to be human, our brilliance and our blindness, our courage and our folly, our grand certainty, and the gentle, terrible ease with which it can be undone. Perhaps it is the completeness of it. The dream, the pride, the warning ignored, the long, slow fall, and at the last, in the cold and the dark, the sudden shining of so much love and courage among ordinary people who had never guessed they carried it. She has become a kind of parable told and retold, not to frighten us, but to remind us softly of what we are, and that is why, on quiet nights like this one, we still gather in the dark to hear her story once again. As for the Titanic herself, she settled slowly down through 2 miles of black and silent water, and came to rest at last upon the floor of the deep, in a cold and lightless place where no storm ever reaches and no season ever turns. And there she lay, lost and unseen, for more than 70 years, while the world above her changed beyond all knowing. When at last she was found, far below in the endless dark, she was broken and gentle with rust, her grand deck silent, her great staircase gone. And yet she was unmistakably herself. She remains there still, resting quietly in the deep, tended only by the slow currents and the patient dark. No longer a ship at all, but a memory made of steel, and one of the most enduring stories the human heart has ever kept. Somewhere above her, the great gray Atlantic rolls on, as it has rolled since long before there were ships to cross it, or people to build them, or names to give the stars. The same waters that carried the ship of dreams, and closed so gently over her, still rise and fall beneath the moon tonight, indifferent and eternal, keeping their long silence over all that they have taken. There is a strange comfort in that thought, held softly in the dark. That the sea does not forget, because the sea does not remember. That it simply holds them all, the 1500, in a peace so deep that no storm of the upper world can ever again reach down to trouble it. The millionaire and the emigrant, the captain and the cabin boy, the mother and her children, the men who built her and the men who played her down into the dark, all of them now are gathered into the same quiet, beyond all class and all striving, beyond cold and fear and time itself. They are at rest, and the sea keeps them gently and rolls on. 100 years and more have passed since that April night, and still, on quiet evenings all over the world, people gather in the dark, as you have gathered now, to hear her story once again. The world she sailed from is gone. Its empires faded, its certainties long since overturned, its people passed into memory. The very ocean liners that once ruled the crossing are themselves a vanished thing, replaced by aeroplanes that leap the Atlantic between a breakfast and a supper. And yet the Titanic sails on, in the one place that no iceberg can reach and no ocean can drown, in the human heart, which keeps her and returns to her and will not let her go. Every generation finds her again, and finds in her something of itself. She has outlived the age that built her, and the age that mourned her, and she will, in all likelihood, outlive ours too, carried forward from one quiet night to the next, one telling to the next, as long as there are people who wish to sit together in the warm dark, and remember and wonder and be gently moved. And so, my friend, the story of the Titanic comes gently to its end. It is a story of great confidence, and of the quiet ways in which confidence can fail. It is a story of riches and of poverty, of the millionaire and the emigrant, who in the end shared the same cold sea. It is a story of courage, of the band that played on, of the men who stood back so that others might live, of the little ship that raced through the ice to save whoever remained. But most of all, it is a reminder, told softly across 100 years, that the world is wide, and the sea is deep, and that even our grandest certainties should be held gently, with humility and with care. The night is long past now. The waters are quiet. The lost are at peace. And there is nothing left for you to do but rest. So let your breathing slow. Let the last of the day drift away. The story is over, the sea is calm, and the embers glow softly in the dark. Sleep now and be well, and whenever you are ready, come back, and we will drift together through another quiet night and another gentle story from the long ago. She had been found. She lay broken upon the ocean floor, her bow and her stern torn apart and settled a little distance from each other, gentle now with rust, draped in long curtains of it that hung like ghostly veils. The grand staircase was gone. The wood had long since vanished into the sea. But she was unmistakably herself, quiet and vast, and strangely at peace, in a cold, dark stillness where no storm would ever trouble her again. It is a strange thing when you consider it, that of all the ships that have ever crossed the sea, and all the wrecks that have ever come to grief upon it, this one should be remembered so and loved so and mourned so 100 years and more after she went down. Greater disasters have come and gone. Larger numbers have been lost. And yet it is the Titanic that the world keeps and returns to again and again in the quiet of its heart. Perhaps it is because she holds in a single night so much of what it is to be human, our brilliance and our blindness, our courage and our folly, our grand certainty and the gentle, terrible ease with which it can be undone. Perhaps it is the completeness of it, the dream, the pride, the warning ignored, the long, slow fall, and at the last, in the cold and the dark, the sudden shining of so much love and courage among ordinary people who had never guessed they carried it. She has become a kind of parable told and retold, not to frighten us, but to remind us softly of what we are, and that is why, on quiet nights like this one, we still gather in the dark to hear her story once again. As for the Titanic herself, she settled slowly down through 2 miles of black and silent water, and came to rest at last upon the floor of the deep, in a cold and lightless place where no storm ever reaches and no season ever turns. And there she lay, lost and unseen, for more than 70 years, while the world above her changed beyond all knowing. When at last she was found, far below in the endless dark, she was broken and gentle with rust, her grand deck silent, her great staircase gone. And yet she was unmistakably herself. She remains there still, resting quietly in the deep, tended only by the slow currents and the patient dark. No longer a ship at all, but a memory made of steel, and one of the most enduring stories the human heart has ever kept. Somewhere above her, the great gray Atlantic rolls on, as it has rolled since long before there were ships to cross it, or people to build them, or names to give the stars. The same waters that carried the ship of dreams and closed so gently over her still rise and fall beneath the moon tonight, indifferent and eternal, keeping their long silence over all that they have taken. There is a strange comfort in that thought, held softly in the dark, that the sea does not forget because the sea does not remember, that it simply holds them all, the 1500, in a peace so deep that no storm of the upper world can ever again reach down to trouble it. The millionaire and the emigrant, the captain and the cabin boy, the mother and her children, the men who built her and the men who played her down into the dark, all of them now are gathered into the same quiet, beyond all class and all striving, beyond cold and fear and time itself. They are at rest, and the sea keeps them gently and rolls on. 100 years and more have passed since that April night, and still, on quiet evenings all over the world, people gather in the dark, as you have gathered now, to hear her story once again. The world she sailed from is gone. Its empires faded, its certainties long since overturned, its people passed into memory. The very ocean liners that once ruled the crossing are themselves a vanished thing, replaced by aeroplanes that leap the Atlantic between a breakfast and a supper. And yet the Titanic sails on, in the one place that no iceberg can reach and no ocean can drown, in the human heart, which keeps her and returns to her and will not let her go. Every generation finds her again and finds in her something of itself. She has outlived the age that built her and the age that mourned her, and she will, in all likelihood, outlive ours too, carried forward from one quiet night to the next, one telling to the next, as long as there are people who wish to sit together in the warm dark and remember and wonder and be gently moved. And so, my friend, the story of the Titanic comes gently to its end. It is a story of great confidence, and of the quiet ways in which confidence can fail. It is a story of riches and of poverty, of the millionaire and the emigrant, who in the end shared the same cold sea. It is a story of courage, of the band that played on, of the men who stood back so that others might live, of the little ship that raced through the ice to save whoever remained. But most of all, it is a reminder, told softly across 100 years, that the world is wide, and the sea is deep, and that even our grandest certainties should be held gently, with humility and with care. The night is long past now. The waters are quiet. The lost are at peace. And there is nothing left for you to do but rest. So let your breathing slow. Let the last of the day drift away. The story is over, the sea is calm, and the embers glow softly in the dark. Sleep now and be well, and whenever you are ready, come back, and we will drift together through another quiet night and another gentle story from the long ago. That the sea does not forget because the sea does not remember. That it simply holds them all, the 1500, in a peace so deep that no storm of the upper world can ever again reach down to trouble it. The millionaire and the emigrant, the captain and the cabin boy, the mother and her children, the men who built her and the men who played her down into the dark, all of them now are gathered into the same quiet, beyond all class and all striving, beyond cold and fear and time itself. They are at rest, and the sea keeps them gently and rolls on. 100 years and more have passed since that April night, and still, on quiet evenings all over the world, people gather in the dark, as you have gathered now, to hear her story once again. The world she sailed from is gone. Its empires faded, its certainties long since overturned, its people passed into memory. The very ocean liners that once ruled the crossing are themselves a vanished thing, replaced by aeroplanes that leap the Atlantic between a breakfast and a supper. And yet the Titanic sails on, in the one place that no iceberg can reach and no ocean can drown, in the human heart, which keeps her and returns to her and will not let her go. Every generation finds her again, and finds in her something of itself. She has outlived the age that built her, and the age that mourned her, and she will, in all likelihood, outlive ours too, carried forward from one quiet night to the next, one telling to the next, as long as there are people who wish to sit together in the warm dark, and remember and wonder and be gently moved. And so, my friend, the story of the Titanic comes gently to its end. It is a story of great confidence, and of the quiet ways in which confidence can fail. It is a story of riches and of poverty, of the millionaire and the emigrant, who in the end shared the same cold sea. It is a story of courage, of the band that played on, of the men who stood back so that others might live, of the little ship that raced through the ice to save whoever remained. But most of all, it is a reminder, told softly across 100 years, that the world is wide, and the sea is deep, and that even our grandest certainties should be held gently, with humility and with care. The night is long past now. The waters are quiet. The lost are at peace. And there is nothing left for you to do but rest. So let your breathing slow. Let the last of the day drift away. The story is over, the sea is calm, and the embers glow softly in the dark. Sleep now and be well, and whenever you are ready, come back, and we will drift together through another quiet night, and another gentle story from the long ago. There is nothing more to do now. Nothing more to think about, nothing more to hold. The story has been told, and the telling is done, and all that remains is the warm dark, and your own slow, easy breathing, and the soft red glow of the embers, rising and fading in the quiet. Let your body grow heavy. Let it sink gently into the bed beneath you, the way a boat settles into still water. Feel the weight leave your shoulders. Feel it leave your arms, your hands, your fingers. Let your jaw soften and your brow and the small muscles around your eyes. There is nowhere you have to be. There is nothing you have to carry. The day is over, and it asks nothing more of you now. Outside, the world goes on as it always has, as it always will. The wide sea rolls under the moon. The stars will slowly overhead. And far away, in the deep and patient dark, the old ship rests, quiet at last, harming no one, troubled by nothing, at peace. And you are here, safe and warm, wrapped in the gentle night, with nothing to fear and nowhere to fall but softly into sleep. So let it come. Do not reach for it and do not hold it off. Just let your breathing slow and slow and slow, and let the embers glow, and let the dark grow soft and deep around you. Rest now. You have done enough. You are exactly where you need to be. And the night will keep you gently until the morning. Sleep well, my friend. Sleep well. And we will meet again, some other quiet night, for another story in the warm and gentle dark.